Hello, and welcome to the Intuitive Ouija. Thanks for clicking on my story. Before we begin, drop your city or country in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from. The attic air was thick with the ghosts of our childhood, a dusty, sweet-smelling haze moated with gold in the slanted afternoon light. And it was Sarah's idea, of course, because it was always Sarah's idea. Her voice cutting through the comfortable silence with that familiar, mischievous lilt that had propelled us into every adventure of our lives. From stealing peaches from Old Man Henderson's orchard to driving all night to see the ocean for the first time with the windows down and our hair whipping like wild flags. "We should do it," she said, her grin a sudden, bright thing in the dimness, and I knew exactly what she meant without her having to say it. The old Ouija board box looking down on us from its perch on a beam, a relic from a slumber party decade past, where we'd mostly just giggled and scared ourselves silly over nothing. "For old time's sake," she added, and how could I say no to Sarah, my Sarah, whose laughter had been the soundtrack to my best memories, whose hand had held mine through my father's funeral, whose face was more familiar to me than my own reflection. We were 32 now, with mortgages and responsibilities, but up in that attic, surrounded by the artifacts of our shared youth. The faded concert tickets, the yearbooks filled with inside jokes, the quilt from our grandmother's house we'd wrapped ourselves in during countless movie nights. We were instantly 16 again, invincible and intertwined. I fetched the box, its cardboard softened at the edges, the word Ouija still bold and mysterious, and we carried it downstairs like a sacred object, the weight of it feeling suddenly more significant than it had a moment before, the playful mood shifting into something more deliberate, more ceremonial, as the autumn sun began to dip below the tree line, casting the living room in long, melancholy shadows. I lit a few candles more for ambience than anything, a gesture towards the spooky atmosphere we were trying to cultivate, their flames flickering and making the walls seem to breathe. And we sat on the floor, knees touching, the board between us on the old Persian rug, its smooth, laminated surface reflecting the dancing light. The planchette, that little heart-shaped piece of wood with its clear plastic window, felt cool and strangely heavy in my fingertips, and Sarah placed her fingers opposite mine, her touch warm and alive, her nails still painted that cheerful, defiant shade of coral she'd always loved, a splash of color against the pale wood. "Remember the last time?" I said, my voice a little too loud in the quiet room, and she laughed, a sound that usually filled every corner of a space, but now seemed to catch in her throat, a brief, dry rattle that was gone as soon as it came. "We asked if Mike Roberts liked you, and it spelled out 'ask him,'" she recalled, and we both smiled, the memory a warm blanket. But then her smile faded just a fraction, a slight tightening around her eyes that I attributed to the strain of looking back. "Okay, quiet now," she whispered, her voice taking on a mock-serious tone, and we both closed our eyes, our breath synchronizing as it had 1,000 times before, in prayer before a big test, in mutual comfort during a sad movie, in the shared anticipation of a secret about to be told. "Is there anyone there?" she asked the empty air, and for a long moment nothing happened, just the sound of the house settling and the distant hum of the refrigerator, the planchette utterly still under our hands, a silly piece of wood and plastic. I was about to open my eyes and suggest we give up this childish game and open a bottle of wine instead when I felt it, the faintest tremor, a vibration so subtle I thought it was my own pulse thrumming through my fingers. But then it moved, a slow, dragging slide towards the corner of the board that held the sun and moon. "Are you doing that?" I whispered, my eyes snapping open to meet Sarah's, which were wide, the pupils dilated in the candlelight, a flicker of something unreadable in their green depths. Not fear, not yet, but a sharp curiosity. "No," she said, and her voice was steady, but I felt the slightest increase of pressure from her fingertips. "I'm not." The planchette continued its lazy path, circling near the G and H before drifting back to the center, and I convinced myself it was our unconscious muscles, our shared expectation willing this movement into being, a collective twitch, nothing more. "What is your name?" Sarah asked, her voice low and clear, and this time, the movement was different, decisive, a direct line to the letter S. then a swift, unnerving glide to a, then R, then a, then H. It stopped squarely on her name. A cold trickle of unease traced my spine. "Very funny, Sarah," I said, trying to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat when I saw her face. She was pale, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "I swear I'm not," she insisted, and her fingers lifted slightly, hovering above the planchette for a moment before settling back down. "Ask another question." My mouth had gone dry. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, the question feeling cliched and stupid, but the planchette was already moving, faster now, with a purpose that felt alien, jerking from our loose guidance to something that seemed to pull us along. It went to S, then I, then C, then K. It spelled sick. The word hung in the air between us, ugly and final. "Sick?" Sarah repeated, a nervous laugh bubbling up. "What does that mean? Is someone sick?" The planchette didn't wait for another question. It shot back to the center and then darted with a terrifying speed to C. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. N, C, E, R, cancer. The word landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. The air left my lungs. Sarah snatched her hands away as if the wood had burned her, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards as she pushed back, her face a mask of stark terror. "No," she said, the word a sharp exhale. "No, that's not funny. Who's doing that?" But we were the only ones in the house. The candles guttered, casting frantic shadows that danced like demons on the walls. The planchette sat motionless on the word, a silent, malevolent accusation. I felt a primal fear, a cold sweat breaking out all over my body. This was no longer a game. It felt like a violation, a poison seeping into our safe, familiar space. "We have to stop," I said, my voice trembling, and I grabbed the planchette, its smooth surface feeling suddenly greasy and wrong, and hurled it across the room where it hit the wall with a dull thud. I then flipped the entire board over, as if to contain the evil, the action feeling both ridiculous and utterly necessary. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, thick and suffocating. We stared at each other, our breath coming in ragged gasps. "It was a joke, right?" Sarah said, but her voice was thin, reedy. We must have pushed it." "Yeah." I agreed too quickly, the word desperate. "Of course we did. Our subconscious or something. We were thinking about being sick, maybe." I read an article about the ideomotor effect. I was babbling, trying to build a wall of logic against the tide of sheer dread that had washed over us. We spent the next hour rationalizing it, clutching our cups of tea like lifelines, the warmth doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. We talked about scary movies we'd seen, about stress at work, about anything but the two words that were seared into my mind, sick and cancer. We eventually managed to laugh, a brittle, hollow sound, and by the time she left, with a hug that felt a little too tight, a little too long, we had almost convinced ourselves it was a bizarre, shared hallucination, a trick of the light and a suggestible mind. But in the days that followed, the memory of the Ouija board was a splinter in my mind, a constant, low-grade anxiety that colored everything. And it was then, in the cold light of day, that I began to notice things, little things I had brushed aside, details my conscious mind had filed away as unimportant, but that now rose to the surface with sinister clarity. I remembered, just a week before the Ouija board, standing next to her in her bright white kitchen as she squeezed lemons for a cocktail, and the harsh fluorescent light had caught her face at an angle, and I'd seen it. A faint, but unmistakable, yellow tinge to the whites of her eyes, like old parchment. I'd mentioned it, and she'd waved a dismissive hand, saying, "Ugh, I know, I'm not sleeping well, I look like a zombie," and I'd accepted it, because we were always tired, weren't we? That was adulthood. I remembered our hike the previous weekend, a trail we'd done 100 times, but this time she had to stop halfway, her breath short, a fine sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool weather. "Just out of shape," she'd panted, leaning against a tree, and I'd teased her about skipping the gym, and we'd laughed, but now I recalled the pallor of her skin, a grayish undertone that had replaced her usual sun-kissed glow. I thought of the way her favorite jeans had seemed a little looser lately, how she joked about her stress diet finally working, and I'd envied her effortless weight loss. And her energy, her brilliant, boundless Sarah energy, had been dimming, not extinguished, but banked like a fire turned low. She'd been quicker to irritability, snapping at a slow barista in a way that was entirely unlike her, and I'd chalked it up to a bad day at the office. These were not dramatic signs. They were whispers, subtle shifts in the landscape of her that my conscious mind, my loving, denial-clad mind, had explained away with perfect, reasonable logic. But my subconscious, that deep, ancient part of me that knew the language of the body, had been keeping score. It had seen the yellow in her eyes, felt the weakness in her limbs, noted the slight hollowing of her cheeks, and it had added it all up into a terrifying sum total. The Ouija board hadn't been a portal to spirits. It had been a conduit for my own hidden knowledge, a terrifyingly literal expression of a truth I knew but refused to know. The weeks turned into a month, and the Ouija board incident became a weird story we didn't tell, a secret shame. But Sarah didn't get better. The fatigue worsened, the jaundice became undeniable, a sickly gold hue to her skin that no amount of concealer could hide, and the pain started, a deep, gnawing ache in her side that she could no longer attribute to a pulled muscle. The day she called me, her voice small and scared, to tell me the doctor had ordered a battery of tests, was the day the fragile wall of my denial began to crumble. The tests led to scans, the scans to a biopsy, and then came the agonizing wait, a period of suspended animation where every phone call sent a jolt of terror through me, and we clung to the hope of a misdiagnosis, a rare infection, anything but the word the Ouija board had spelled out. We sat in the oncologist's office, a room designed to be calming with its soft colors and bland artwork, but nothing could soften the blow of the man's calm, measured voice. He spoke of a rare, aggressive cancer, of tumors in places I couldn't pronounce, of a prognosis that was stark and statistical. And then he said it, the words that ripped the world out from under me. The symptoms you've been experiencing, the jaundice, the profound fatigue, the unexplained weight loss, the pain, these are classic indicators. They would have been present, likely for several months, gradually worsening. It was as if he had reached inside my skull and rearranged my reality. The room tilted. The doctor's voice became a distant hum. I looked at Sarah, saw the tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, but all I could see was the Ouija board, the planchette sliding with that awful, deliberate force from letter to letter. SICK, CNCR. It hadn't been a prediction. It had been a diagnosis my own mind had already made, pieced together from 1,000 tiny, overlooked clues. The horror that washed over me then was colder and more profound than any fear of ghosts or demons. It was the horror of hindsight, the crushing weight of what I had seen but not recognized. The next few months were a blur of hospitals and chemotherapy, a brutal war fought with poison and hope, and I was there for every moment, holding her hand when she was sick, reading to her when she was too weak to talk, trying to pour all my love and strength into her fading body. But the cancer was relentless, a voracious thing that consumed her vitality, her laughter, her very essence, until all that was left was a fragile shell in a hospital bed. In her final days, she was lucid for a brief moment, her hand weakly squeezing mine, and she whispered, "Remember that stupid board?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face, unable to speak. "It knew," she said, her voice a faint echo. "It knew before we did." And then she was gone, and a silence fell over my life that was deeper and more absolute than any I had ever known. In the year that has passed since Sarah's death, I have not feared the Ouija board. I threw it away, not as an object of evil, but as a relic of a truth too terrible to bear. The terror I live with now is not of the supernatural, but of the supernatural, the capabilities of the human mind that lie buried beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts. The Ouija board did not know my best friend was dying. I did. Some deep, primal part of me, the part that loved her more than life itself, had been reading the silent, desperate signals of her body, translating the slight yellowing of her sclera, the fractional loss of weight, the microscopic dimming of the light in her eyes, into a scream that could only be expressed through the childish theater of a board game. It was my own intuition, my own love, made manifest in the most terrifyingly literal way possible. The planchette was not moved by spirits. It was moved by the silent, screaming knowledge of my own subconscious, a knowledge so devastating that my waking mind had to dress it in the costume of the occult to even begin to process it. The true horror is not that there are ghosts in the world, but that we carry within us a knowingness so profound and so subtle that we are strangers to it, and that sometimes, in our desperation to understand the whispers of our own souls, we invent demons to explain the terrible, beautiful, and utterly natural wisdom of our own hearts. The silence she left behind was not an empty one, but a space crowded with ghosts, not of the supernatural kind I had fleetingly feared that night with the board, but with the relentless, haunting presence of memory, 1,000 Sarahs flickering at the edges of every room, her laugh echoing from the kitchen when I made my morning coffee, the impression of her body still visible on the cushion of my sofa where she always curled her feet beneath her, the scent of her shampoo lingering in my bathroom linen closet on the spare towel she'd used during her last visit, a faint, fruity fragrance that would ambush me at the most ordinary moments, triggering a grief so physical it would double me over, a sharp, winding pain in my gut that was far more real than any phantom from a spirit world could ever be. I stopped trying to explain the Ouija board incident to anyone, because how could I possibly articulate the chillingly rational, yet utterly insane, truth that the terror of that evening was not that some external malevolent force had spoken, but that the most loving, connected part of my own mind had been screaming a warning in a language I could only understand when filtered through the absurd theater of a Parker Brothers game. My grief became a private second skin, a heavy garment I wore every day, and woven into its fabric was this terrifying awe of my own brain, this cold, clinical fascination with the machinery of intuition that had, with brutal efficiency, diagnosed my best friend months before any medical professional. I began to obsess over the minutiae of those last few months, replaying every interaction, every conversation, every fleeting glance like a detective searching for clues in a crime scene that was my own life. And I saw the evidence with horrifying clarity, not as isolated incidents, but as a coherent, dreadful narrative. The time she'd flinched when I'd hugged her too tightly, a wince she'd covered with a cough, the way she'd started preferring bland foods, claiming a newfound sensitivity to spices when she had once been an adventurous eater who loved the burn of chilies, the novel she'd been reading for weeks, a thin paperback she normally would have devoured in a day, sitting untouched on her nightstand, its bookmark barely moving, a testament to a concentration that had frayed, an energy for life that was quietly leaching away. These were not supernatural portents. They were biological facts, written on her body in a script my conscious mind was illiterate to read, but that some deeper, older part of me had translated with perfect, terrible accuracy. I found myself in the months after her funeral engaging in a strange, compulsive behavior, sitting quietly in my living room with my hands resting on the coffee table, not on a board, but on the barewood surface, trying to quiet the chatter of my thoughts, to listen for that subterranean voice, to see if I could access that hidden knowledge again, to prove to myself it was real, that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing, that the weight of the planchette pulling our hands had been as tangible as the weight of the loss I now carried. But there was only silence, my own lonely pulse in my fingertips, the vast, unknowable quiet of my own mind, and I realized that the channel, that conduit, had been forged specifically by and for Sarah, that our bond had been the circuit through which that awful truth could flow, and without her, the connection was dead, leaving me with only the echo of its existence, a phantom limb of intuition that ached with its absence. The world became a different place, a landscape where the line between what I knew and what I knew was forever blurred, where I found myself watching my other friends, my family, with a new, hyper-vigilant anxiety, searching their faces for any slight discoloration, listening to their voices for any hint of fatigue, terrified that I might see another story written in the subtle language of the body, a story I did not want to read. I had become an unwilling oracle, cursed not with foresight, but with a devastatingly acute form of hindsight that colored every memory and poisoned every present moment with the fear of what I might be missing, what subtle clues might be passing me by now. The Ouija board had not been a window to the afterlife. It had been a mirror reflecting the deepest, most terrifying part of myself back at me. The part that loved so fiercely it could sense the cellular rebellion happening inside the person I loved most. The part that was so intimately connected to another human being that our biology, for a fleeting, horrifying moment, became a shared language. And in the end, that is the most profound and lasting horror. The realization that the bond we shared was so absolute, so woven into the very fiber of our beings, that her body's betrayal was a tremor mine could feel across the space between us. A silent scream that my conscious ears were too deaf to hear, but that my soul, my boundless, connected soul, could not ignore, and so it found the only way it could to make me listen, using the silly, plastic tool of our childhood to spell out a truth. Too devastating for words, a truth that continues to live and breathe inside me, not as a ghost, but as the final, crushing, and most beautiful testament to a friendship that was, in every sense of the word, inseparable. And now, a year and a day after her funeral, the silence has become a permanent resident in my house, a presence more tangible than any furniture. And I find myself talking to it, not in the hopeful way one prays to a god, but in the resigned way one might converse with a terminal illness that has become a part of them, acknowledging its weight, its shape, its particular texture in the room. And this evening, driven by a compulsion I cannot name, I went back up to the attic, the air even thicker now, the dust motes looking like frozen ash in the beam of my flashlight. And I found it, not the Ouija board which I had burned in a cathartic, futile bonfire in the backyard, but the quilt, her grandmother's quilt, still folded neatly in the old oak chest. And I brought it down, shaking off the ghosts of a happier past, and I wrapped myself in it, sitting in the exact spot on the floor where we had sat that last fateful night. And the fabric still smells faintly of her, of Sarah, that unique scent of vanilla shampoo and clean sweat and unwavering friendship. And I closed my eyes, my hands resting palms up on my knees, and I tried to feel for that connection again, not to the spirit world, but to the part of my own mind that had known the silent, subterranean river of intuition that had once broken its banks with such catastrophic force. But there is nothing, only the vast, empty plain of my grief, the knowledge that the circuit is broken forever, that the other half of my consciousness is gone, and with it, that terrifying, miraculous ability to know. And I understand now that the horror was never in the prediction, but in the connection itself, a bond so profound that it transcended the individual self and became a shared nervous system. And her death was not just the loss of my best friend, but the amputation of that part of my own soul, leaving me with this phantom pain, this agonizing awareness of a faculty I can no longer access, a language I can no longer speak. And the Ouija board was merely the seizure, the violent, involuntary spasm of that connection as it was severed, the last desperate signal, fired across a dying neural pathway, spelling out not a curse, but a final, heartbreaking message of love from a part of me that was already mourning, a part that knew, long before the rest of me could bear to, that the light of my life was going out, and that I would be left here, in the growing dark, alone with the unbearable weight of having known it all along. And so I sit here in the perpetual twilight of my grief, the quilt a poor substitute for the warmth of her presence, and the realization dawns on me with a quiet, chilling finality that the true haunting was never about an object or an omen, but about the terrifying intimacy of love itself, a force so powerful it can sense the silent, internal unraveling of another being, and that the Ouija board incident was merely the moment my profound, cellular-level connection to Sarah finally bypassed the defenses of my conscious mind and staged its desperate, symbolic intervention, a pageant of fear designed to force me to see what I already knew in the very marrow of my bones. And now, in the absolute stillness she left behind, I am left to grapple not with ghosts but with the monstrous, beautiful truth that to love someone completely is to become so entwined that their body's secrets become your own, their impending absence a shadow that falls across your soul long before it darkens your door. And the horror is not that the board knew, but that I did, that we are all perhaps capable of such deep, unspoken knowing, and that love is both the most human of miracles and the most terrifying of oracles, a truth I will carry with me, a cold and comfortless companion, for all the silent days that remain. The silence has now become a language I am slowly learning to decipher, its grammar one of absence, and its vocabulary made up of all the things she will never say again. And I find myself listening to it more intently than I ever listened to the whispers of a planchette, because this silence is the real message, the final, unanswerable truth that the board was only ever a clumsy, frantic attempt to articulate, and in this long, slow excavation of my own grief, I have begun to understand that the subconscious mind is not a separate entity but the deepest, most honest layer of the self, the part that keeps score when the conscious mind is too busy or too frightened to look, and it speaks in a tongue of symptoms and sensations, in the cold dread that arrives unannounced, and the inexplicable ache that has no physical source. And it was this voice, my own true voice, that used the board as a megaphone, and the weight I feel now is the burden of that self-knowledge, the understanding that I am equipped with a sensitivity I never wanted, a radar tuned to frequencies of loss, and I move through the world now like a ghost myself, hyper-aware of the fragility in every smile, the slight tremor in a handshake, the fleeting shadow in a friend's eye, constantly braced for the next silent scream from the depths of my own being, terrified that this awful faculty might one day activate again, that I might feel that same terrible pull towards a different awful truth about someone else I love. And this is the perpetual horror, the curse of the oracle. Not that you foretell the future, but that you are forever after condemned to see the present with terrifying, unbearable clarity, to read the secret sorrows written in the very cells of those around you, to know, with a certainty that is both a gift and a damnation, that love and loss are not two separate experiences but the same devastating coin. And I am left here, in the quiet aftermath, the sole translator of a message that was never meant for me alone, the keeper of a truth that was too heavy for one heart to hold. And so I hold it, and I wait, and I listen to the silence, which has become the only thing she has left me, and the only thing I have left to say. And in this endless listening I have come to a conclusion that is as close to peace as I will ever get, that the Ouija board was not an instrument of prophecy, but a symptom of a love so absolute it became a physical law, a gravity between two souls so strong that the first, faint dimming of one could be felt as a tremor in the other, and my subconscious, that faithful, terrified scribe, was merely the first to record the seismic shift, translating the quantum decay of her health into the crude, alphabetical language of panic. And so the horror transforms once more, not into something lighter but into something denser, more profound, the realization that the love we shared was a tangible force, as real as gravity or radiation, with its own detectable signals and inevitable consequences, and that her death was not a random tragedy, but an event my entire being was wired to anticipate. A cataclysm my soul began mourning months before my heart could admit it was happening. And this knowledge is my inheritance, the final, unbreakable thread still connecting me to her. A thread woven from the terrifying truth that to be truly known by another person is to be vulnerable to a knowledge that transcends the conscious mind. A knowledge that can spell out your fate on a child's toy before you yourself have even begun to suspect it. And I will live with this not as a curse, but as the ultimate evidence of what we were, a bond that not even death could completely sever. Because the part of me that knew her dying is the same part of me that keeps her alive now, not as a memory, but as a permanent, painful, and exquisite truth etched into the very fabric of my being. The seasons have turned without her, a brutal and beautiful mechanical process that feels like a personal insult, each budding leaf and fall of snow a reminder of a world that continues to spin on its axis, indifferent to the cataclysm that has hollowed out my own. And I have started to notice a change in the quality of the silence that surrounds me. It is no longer a void but a medium, like deep water. And in its depths I sometimes imagine I can feel a faint, familiar pressure, not a voice or a sign, but a simple, enduring presence, the way one might feel the moon's pull on a tide. And I understand now that this is what remains of the connection, not the frantic, screaming signal of the Ouija board, but a constant, low-frequency hum. The background radiation of a love that was too vast to simply vanish. And with this understanding comes the final, chilling evolution of the horror, which is that there is no end to it. There is no closure, only this endless integration of the truth into the daily fact of my existence, the acceptance that I am forever altered, that my perception has been permanently calibrated to a finer, more painful frequency, and that the weight I carry is not a burden I will one day set down, but a new center of gravity. And I must learn to walk again with this ballast of knowing, to navigate a world where every joy is tempered by the memory of its inevitable loss, and every love from this day forward will be shadowed by the ghost of this first, terrible and magnificent knowing. And so I move forward, not away from the horror but into it, making a home in the aftermath, learning to breathe the thin air of a world where the most profound truths are not spoken but felt, not heard in the chatter of a planchette, but in the relentless, whispering silence of a love that knew no bounds, not even the final, absolute bound of death itself. And so this is where I am now, a permanent resident of the aftermath, a citizen of a country whose only landscape is memory, and whose only weather is the slow, constant erosion of grief. And I have come to understand that the Ouija board was not the beginning of the story, but the end of the old one, the violent, rupturing event that shattered the comfortable illusion of our separateness and revealed the terrifying intimacy that had always existed beneath the surface of our friendship, and intimacy so complete that her body's whispered distress became a shout in my own nervous system, and the horror has finally settled into a kind of grim companionship, a fact of my existence as fundamental as my own heartbeat, the knowledge that I am capable of a knowing that bypasses reason, a love that functions as a sixth sense. And while this ability feels like a curse, a wound that will never fully heal, it is also the most authentic part of her legacy, the proof that what we had was not a sentimental idea but a physiological reality, a bond that could transmit a diagnosis like a nerve transmitting pain. And as I look out the window at the world going about its business, I feel a strange, detached pity for everyone who still believes in the simple boundary of their own skin, who think their loves are just emotions and not these vast, interconnected biological systems. And I know I can never go back to that innocence. I am condemned to this clarity, to seeing the invisible threads that bind us and the silent screams they can carry. And this is my life now, a continuous, unbroken paragraph of waiting and listening, not for a message from beyond, but for the echo of my own submerged truth, the hum of the connection that death itself could not entirely silence, a low, persistent vibration that is the only thing left of the woman I loved, and the only thing that tells me I am still somehow alive.